So are we officially recording? Hell yeah. What's up, everybody? My name is Lily Lady. I'm going to be reading to you from the Communist Manifesto. It's an up-and-coming book by Frederick Engels and Karl Marx. I don't know if any of you have stumbled upon their names, but I'm just going to get into it. I'll read for about 15 minutes. Sam, will you cue me when it's 6:15? Because then we're going to start a scintillating dialogue about the implications of these words with some very exciting guests. All right. Manifesto of the Communist Party. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this specter. Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals, and German police spies. Where is the party in opposition that has not been decried as communistic by its opponents in power? Where the opposition that has not hurled back the branding reproach of communism against the more advanced opposition parties, as well as against its reactionary adversaries? Two things result from this fact. One, communism is already acknowledged by all European powers to be in itself a power. Two, it is high time that communists should openly, in the face of the whole world, publish their views, their aims, their tendencies, and meet this nursery tale of the specter of communism with a manifesto of the party itself. To this end, the communists of various nationalities have assembled in London and sketched the following manifesto to be published in the English, French, German, Italian, Flemish, and Danish languages. So that's a little intro. I'll also just take this time to plug my OnlyFans, which you can find on OnlyFans at Lit with Lily. I read the Communist Manifesto fully clothed over the course of my videos in different locations. I highly recommend subscribing. You pay me $10 a month and I give you literature and titillation, but more literature than titillation. But I may change that balance depending on customer reviews. So get out there. Okay, 1. Bourgeois and proletarians. How am I doing on time, Sam? How much time do I have? 6. Oh, it's only 6 now? Wow, okay. Oh, we started early. Okay, great. But we're still going. That's all good. I can't tell if people are on this link that, whatever. All right. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, that each time ended, either in the revolutionary reconstitution of society at large, or in the common ruin of the contending classes. In the earlier epochs of history, we can find almost anywhere a complicated arrangement of society into various orders, a manifold gradation of social rank. In ancient Rome, we have patricians, knights, plebeians, slaves. In the Middle Ages, feudal lords, vassals, guildmasters, journeymen, apprentices, serfs. In almost all these classes, again, subordinate gradations. The modern bourgeois society that has sprouted from the ruins of feudal society has not done away with class antagonisms. It has but established new classes, new conditions of oppression, new forms of struggle in place of the old ones. Our epoch, the epoch of the bourgeois, possesses, however, this distinctive feature. It simplifies the class antagonisms. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, into two great classes directly facing each other, bourgeoisie and proletariat. From the serfs of the Middle Ages sprang the chartered burghers of the earliest towns. From these burgesses, the first elements of the bourgeoisie were developed. The discovery of America, the rounding of the Cape, opened up fresh ground for the rising bourgeoisie. The East Indian and Chinese markets, the colonization of America, trade with the colonies, the increase in the means of exchange and in commodities generally, gave to commerce, to navigation, to industry, an impulse never before known, and thereby, to the revolutionary element in the tottering feudal society, a rapid development. The feudal system of industry, under which industrial production was monopolized by close guilds, now no longer sufficed for the growing wants of the new markets. The manufacturing system took its place. The guild masters were pushed on one side by the manufacturing middle class. Division of labor between the different corporate guilds vanished in the face of division of labor in each single workshop. Meantime, the markets kept ever growing, the demand ever rising. Even manufacture no longer sufficed. Thereupon steam and machinery revolutionized industrial production. The place of manufacture was taken by the giant, modern industry. The place of the industrial middle class by industrial millionaires. The leaders of whole industrial armies, the modern bourgeois. Modern industry has established the world's market, for which the discovery of America paved the way. The market has given an immense development to commerce, to navigation, to communication by land. This development has, in turn, reacted on the extension of industry, and in proportion as industry, commerce, navigation, and railways extended, in the same proportion the bourgeoisie developed, increased its capital, and pushed into the background every class handed down from the Middle Ages. We see, therefore, how the modern bourgeoisie is itself the product of a long course of development, of a series of revolutions in the modes of production and exchange. Each step in the development of the bourgeoisie was accompanied by a corresponding political advance of that class. An oppressed class under the sway of the feudal nobility, an armed and self-governing association in the medieval commune, here an independent urban republic as in Italy and Germany, there a taxable third estate of the monarchy as in France. Afterwards, in the period of manufacture proper, serving either the semi-feudal or the absolute monarchy as a counterpoise against the nobility, and, in fact, cornerstone of the great monarchies in general, the bourgeoisie has at least, since the establishment of modern industry and of the world's market, conquered for itself, in the modern representative state, exclusive political sway. The executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie, historically, has played a most revolutionary part. The bourgeoisie, wherever it has got the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. It has pitiless torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors, and has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, callous cash payment. It has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism, in the icy water of egotistical calculation. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value, and in place of the numberless, indefeasible, chartered freedoms, has set up that single unconscionable freedom, free trade. In one word, for exploitation, veiled by religious and political illusions, it has substituted naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. The bourgeoisie has stripped of its halo every occupation hitherto honored and looked up to with reverent awe. It has converted the physician, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science into its paid wage laborers. The bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its sentimental veil, has reduced the family relation to mere money relation. The bourgeoisie has disclosed how it came to pass that the brutal display of vigor in the Middle Ages, which reactionists so much admire, found its fitting complement in the most slothful indolence. It has been the first to show what man's activity can bring about. It has accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals. It has conducted expeditions that put in the shade all former exoduses of nations and crusades. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. Conservation of the old modes of production in unaltered forms was, on the contrary, the first condition of existence for all earlier industrial classes. Constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. All fixed, fast frozen relations, with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions, are swept away. All new formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts to air, and all that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. Also, may I just take this moment to say, I'm just going to plug Michael Berman's book. I think that's his name, All That Solid Melts into Air. It's really good. It's based on this very line on page 27 of my edition, which is, I'll just read it again because it's worth repeating. All that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. Oh, so gorgeous. Marx really knows how to write it. Sam, what time do we have here? Okay, cool. Who's got a... Yeah, we have a system of labor exchange here. In exchange for fiat currency, we're having some pizza. 7 minutes. Okay, I have some time to read a couple more pages of this scintillating book. The need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the whole surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. The bourgeoisie has, through its exploitation of the world's market, given a cosmopolitan character to production and consumption in every country. To the great chagrin of reactionists, it is drawn from under the feet of industry, the national ground on which it stood. All old established national industries have been destroyed or are daily being destroyed. They are dislodged by new industries, whose introduction becomes a life and death question for all civilized nations, by industries that no longer work up indigenous raw material, but raw material drawn from the remotest zones. Industries whose products are consumed not only at home, but in every quarter of the globe. In place of the old wants satisfied by the productions of the country, we find new wants, requiring for their satisfaction the products of distant lands and climes. In the place of the old local and national seclusion and self-sufficiency, we have intercourse in every direction, universal interdependence of nations. And as in material, so also in intellectual production. The intellectual creations of individual nations become common property. National one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness become more and more impossible, and from the numerous national and local literatures, there arises a world literature. Also, I'll just pause here to recommend, this section can be read really beautifully in conjunction with Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, which is grossly misunderstood in common kind of intellectual discourse. But this passage in general, just about kind of cultural diffusion and exchange, is read really nicely with Adam Smith. Okay. The bourgeoisie, by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production, by the immensely facilitated means of communication, draws all, even the most barbarian nations, into civilization. The cheap prices of its commodities are the heavy artillery with which it batters down all Chinese walls, which it forces the barbarians' intensely obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate. It compels all nations, on pain of extinction, to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst, i.e., to become bourgeois themselves. In one word, it creates a world after its own image. The bourgeoisie has subjected the country to the rule of the towns. It has created enormous cities, has greatly increased the urban population as compared with the rural, and has thus rescued a considerable part of the population from the idiocy of rural life. Just as it has made the country dependent on the towns, So it has made barbarian and semi-barbarian countries dependent on the civilized ones, nations of peasants on nations of bourgeois, the East on the West. The bourgeoisie keeps more and more doing away with the scattered state of the population, of the means of production, and of property. It has agglomerated population, centralized means of production, and has concentrated property in a few hands. The necessary consequence of this was political centralization. Independent or but loosely connected provinces with separate interests, laws, governments, and systems of taxation became lumped together into one nation with one government, one code of laws, one national class interest, one frontier, and one customs tariff. I think this is a nice natural place to talk about our guest today, which I'll just intro. We have 3 really exciting people to chat with, and I'm super pumped. And I'm just going to pull up their bios. Okay, so what we're going to do, so I'm just going to lay out kind of the itinerary of the evening here. I'm already having the best time. So I just read a little bit from the Communist Manifesto, and next we're going to have a kind of open-ended dialogue. I'm just going to facilitate some people far more intellectual than I in discussions of Marx. I'm really interested in hearing and thinking about the implications of this text, other works of Marx, kind of where, as it stands today, like how do we contextualize what Marx is saying with relevance to our current kind of economic realities, social realities, and cultural realities. So that's something that interests me, but I'm excited to see where the conversation goes, and I have absolutely no agenda. And then we're going to hear some music, so that's going to be poppin'. We have two exciting DJs coming in to spin. Okay, so one of our panelists today is Matthew Donovan, a friend of mine, who is founder of the Future Left, educator at Feminist AI, and co-host of the Neoliberal Hell podcast. Highly recommend anyone who's not subscribed to the Patreon, or if you're not involved in the Neoliberal Hell universe, I highly recommend getting involved. We had a really scintillating and popping discussion about Elena Bobbitt a while ago, so that was a pleasure. This will be a little different. Who's to say, but there might be less overlaps in that discussion in this one. Another of our panelists is Ulysses Carrier, who is thinking the genealogical turn after leaving a PhD at Stanford University to consecrate themselves to philosophy. I don't really know what that means, but I'm excited to learn what that means together with all of you. We also have Barrett Avner, who's a musician/writer and producer/host of the Contain podcast. So these are our beginning panelists, and then later we'll have 2 DJs, which I'm super pumped about listening to them spin. But I'll just turn to the 3 of y'all. We're doing something. I'm the least technologically savvy person in the universe, so I think we're streaming on multiple platforms, I believe. And I think that Matthew and I think everyone's in the chat. I don't think so, not for right now. But so yeah, let's just open it up. I think if anyone talks, I'll be able to hear you, because we have our panelists here. So whoever wants to just start, go for it. I've heard my own voice far too much this evening. Okay, Matthew, can you hear me? Here's Sam. One of you try to... We're having some technical difficulties, but we're in the show. Everyone... Matthew, we could hear you before, but now we can't hear any of you. Oh my gosh. What does this say about the alienation of the worker? Okay, wait. What should we do, Matthew? Chaos ensues. Maybe it's because we're streaming. Why don't we try to... Okay, we're going to take the stream off. Okay, now someone talk. I don't think it's the stream. No. What if I undo this? Yeah, undo. Okay, try one more time. Oh, yeah, now we can hear you. Wait, did you hear me before? Oh, for only... Wait, what? Did you hear me for the last, 20 minutes? Oh, okay, that's so weird. I wonder why that happened. Yeah, totally. Can I have your phone? Yeah, I wonder. So I guess the people here just won't. Can I just grab your phone? Yeah. Okay, let me just reintroduce everyone because apparently we had some technical difficulties, but I'm glad you could hear the important part. And again, I'll just take this moment to plug my OnlyFans, which is Lit with Lily. You can subscribe for $10 a month, and I read various leftist texts, including the communist. Well, the first text that I read is the Communist Manifesto. OnlyFans, Lit with Lily. Okay, so Barrett Avner is a musician slash writer and producer slash host of the Contain podcast. Ulysses Carrier is thinking the genealogical turn after leaving a PhD at Stanford University to consecrate themselves to philosophy. Matthew Donovan is founder of the Future Left, educator at Feminist AI, and co-host of the Neoliberal podcast. I'm going to open it up to the three of you to discuss anything that you would wish to discuss. And thank you all for being here.
But yeah, so as we're establishing what we think of Marx and the contemporary, I think there's some basic premises that we can establish that are probably still relevant just for the audience. Marx talked about globalization and imperialization. These things obviously still exist. The negative role of financial capital, although it's way more abstract now, and Barrett will talk on this, but we exist in the age of fictitious capital. Class struggle, of course, the instability of capitalism and cyclical cycles, and the concentration of and centralization of capital itself. So these are some of the themes that I think we can talk about further, but I think these are some of the things that seem more on the level of common sense. Did Barrett or Ulysses, do you want to respond to that at all? To that list. Okay.
No. If you want to if you want to continue on.
Okay. Cool. Awesome.
I would just like to add one thing, which is an observation from Jehu. I don't know if you know about Damn Jehu, his blog, The Real Movement. He basically makes the argument that economic growth is the premise of all technical reforms. So I'm interested in the excess. Briefly in the Grungers, he talked a little bit about the tendency for the rate of profit to fall. Now we sort of ushered into this newer stage, because if you're going to talk about things materially, you have to actually examine the paradigm that we actually exist in. Like, what is the stage of industrialization that we are technically in right now? And essentially, it's a form of worldwide socialism, managerialism. You have this large sort of cartel it's sort of running on, it's firing sort of off of its own productive forces, but it's basically deaf, dumb, and blind. It's an appendage of techne itself. So I really am interested in identifying what stage of industrialization are we in right now, and if the tendency of profit is not falling for a certain demographic because it's only accelerating for one, what do you do practically in your life to sort of undermine that? That's basically what finance punk is about. So that's just a side note. If you guys, anybody wants to,
we should get into that
later.
Yeah, we should get into that for sure. Ulysses, did you want to respond to that at all?
I think that's super interesting.
Yeah, totally. I would respond and probably just say that, and Barrett and I have talked about this, that we live in an age where where the industrialization is largely subsidized by a state that basically has been decrepit of funding, but largely has upheld capital interest through printing presses, basically. But we're also in an age where there's a large shift towards possible crisis, as Emmanuel Wallerstein talks about. Basically, the crisis of capitalism is in part trying to be dampened by the idea of abstracting capital and printing capital via now a digital money system.
Right.
And as the abstraction intensifies, we've seen the age that we enter go away from Marx's vision of money as a social money, so as a social technology. And so that this opens up new questions of what is next for an era of money that is not just fictitious, but instrumentalized completely for non-human means, or not for states, as states slowly start to be hollowed out by the intensification of neoliberalism. This is kind of a philosophical. This is kind of the philosophical element that undermines where I think we are. Barrett, did you want to respond to that at all, or?
No, I think that's pretty much right on the money. One of my favorite passages from Volume 3 has to do with circulationism, and if I could just quote this: although the excess value of a commodity over its cost price is shaped in the immediate process of production, it is realized only in the process of circulation. So when you talk about abstracted capital, we could talk about the Bretton Woods agreement all the way through the global ending of fiat. These were basically, in the 20th century, there was a mass sort of process to abstract capital, which Alfred Sohn Rethel describes as basically, in a sort of anti-Kantian turn, that epistemology and all knowledge, what people might call the postmodern condition, Berman actually in All That Solid Melts Into, I forgot that. Sorry to
Somebody asked, where the fuck is the barbecue sauce, by the way?
Oh shit! Well, the BBQ, that's really important. We'll get into that. So to finish this quote, so it is realized only in the process of circulation. So if that's the case, and basically money is, as you said, it's almost false, it's fake, it's not tethered to anything sort of substantial. And the whole notion of abstract stored value goes way back to the axial age. Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Karl Jaspers, they did a lot of anthropological research on this. And I'm basically just agreeing with you. I'm sorry. I could continue later. I just want to hear your response to that.
Oh no, you don't have to stop. No. Do you want to explain the you were talking about Ponty? Do you want to elaborate on that really quickly?
Well,
jump in as well.
Well, I mean, basically, the axial age, you had the development of currency that happened roughly within 100-year span across 5 different continents, completely not interdependent of one. Like there was no dialectical exchange whatsoever. And I want Ulysses to talk a little bit about why Marx is not a dialectical thinker, which I agree with.
Oh,
and as Jehu once said to me, he said, once you hear a Marxist start to talk about the dialectic, you know you're about to hear some bullshit. So I thought that was funny.
That is funny.
So if epistemology, what we quantify, let's just call it human for a second, for lack of a better term, is downstream from finance,
right,
and from financialization and abstract stored value, what does that impart on the subject? What does that tell you about society? There really is no society, which is why I don't believe we live in a society. I don't believe that any of these problems can be solved within the realm of the political whatsoever. They almost have to be completely devoid of dialectics.
Ulysses, do you want to talk about the idea of why you have a problem with Marx being being focused on material dialectics?
Not particularly, because we don't really have time for that. But
oh no,
I think there was something very interesting that Barrett was saying, which is like you were talking about 2 things I think that I got, which was like you were talking about the subject, and you were talking also about like the composition of capital, because you were talking about how much of, let's say, quote, like with scare quotes, money there is in capital, because of course capital is not money. Capital is just, it's a process, right? So one of the questions, like, how is capital composed? Like, how much money goes into capital? Like, I mean, how much wages, for example, how much, like, and how much machines, right? So this was one of the questions that agitated Deleuze a lot, which is the question of like the organic composition of capital, which
Right.
is something that's discussed by Marx quite a few times. You have a good discussion of it in the Grundrisse, and also, if I'm remembering correctly, in the he goes over it in the results of the direct production process, and the question is, in the circulation process of capital, how much of it is going to be money and how much of it is going to be machine. And because the part of it that is going to be money, that's the part of it that is going to be converted into living labor. And there's another one, like the part of it that goes into fixed capital, that is literally like congealed labor under like the form of technology of a machine. So you have like living means of production, that's humans, and then you have like the machines. And
right,
one of the questions was like, is there a moment in history at which point the like the technical composition of capital is more important than the amount of wages, which is like when you invest more in machines than in living labor. And I think for Deleuze that was in the 60s, and he said that would entirely change how the subject worked in a society, because you no longer pay people to do something, you pay people to place them at a certain moment within a machinic production process in order to act upon a machine that is already running, rather than yourself being the machine. So like in later forms of capitalism, when you have like a higher organic composition of capital, you have this situation where there is no longer the production of subjects by capital, because what capital actually needs is only people to act upon a machinic process that's already going on, and not
Right.
to themselves insert themselves within that process.
Right.
I could just quickly respond to part of that. I think I partly agree with Deleuze in the sense that the idea of labor, Marx is, for those that don't know, Marx's split with the German idealists was the idea that the conceptual realm was what formed reality. Um, Even though he shared this idea of species being, and this idea that through sensuous reality, which is like how we move in, like how we move within reality, basically in Marxist terms would be by doing labor, is how we create and interact with reality, but we can't otherwise access a version of reality. And that in Feuerbach's terms, this transcendence that we want to, Feuerbach believes in the idea of like the alienation from transcendence, basically. But Marx would argue that that the closest we can get would be through some collectivization. And so, I mean, in the current era, you know, we have things like identity politics, and we also have the further alienation from capital via underexploitation, where basically you have Barrett talks about this actually a little bit, but you have this idea where you don't have enough jobs because the machines have basically started to replace a lot of the lower and middle tier jobs, along with new forms of hyper precarious labor, where even CEOs are now being tempted in as a temp service.
Yeah, but the machines do not replace you. I think that's a misunderstanding. It's because this labor is already automated. It's the only question is, will it be a human machine doing it, or will it be like a technological machine doing it? But like there's no one is getting replaced in the circulation process of capital. It's all this labor is already automated.
I mean, I think it's like I think like 5% of jobs are being replaced every year. So I think consistently it's not as much as like people had theorized. They said that 30% of the labor force would be extracted into machines. But I think the overall idea that I'm just getting at is not whether or not machines. I do think that humans act as machines. I agree with that. I'm just more saying that Marx's main idea was overexploitation of the labor force, but I'm saying that if automation and machines are to replace that, the problem for humanity would be underexploitation. Basically, there would be no work to be done.
I would challenge that. I would challenge that.
Yeah, Marx says the opposite.
Marx says one thing Marx remarked on in Volume 3, which is his most probably quote unquote accelerationist writing, is the relationships of capital are obscured by the fact that all parts of capital appear equally as the source of excess value slash profit. Now, that to me sort of that brings into question not this notion of under exploitation, but of excess value and abundance of value. Can you guys hear me? Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So to me, if all of these things, whether it's climate change, uh, war, these are all aided and abetted by this obscuring of excess value slash profit. Now, one of the biggest problems, and this is why I'm not a leftist at all. I'm not right wing. I don't think Marxism actually fits in with either one of those categories. But the left tends to focus on this notion of social alienation. Now, Marx, especially mature Marx, was mostly focused on the alienation of the subject with production itself. And, Kojev, he speaks a little bit about this too, um, especially in his later writings, actually beyond his sort of his Hegel lecturing period. That really we have to look at it as a problem of selective abundance and the obscuration of the social, because the social is the kind of, it's like the dialectical telling you, oh, this is how it is, this is how it is, because we relate to things dialectically and socially. But the process of capital is literally it's just a juggernaut. It doesn't care about that at all. So in order to sort of address this problem, Son Rethel, he talks a little bit about medieval peasant and artisan production and the features of antiquity, which give a social context to the category of money as capital and why that changed, whether it be merchants, usurers, and even predatory capital, and how throughout time it failed to communicate its social character to labor, because labor is machinic. It just doesn't give a fuck. Like the left, they can complain all they want. It's not going to change anything, right? Like that's just a fact. So that's one thing I would bring in there. And ultimately, so my hypothesis is more of an alienation from the productive forces than anything else.
Yeah. If you oh
Go for it. I think Matthew might have dropped out because of his. I know he was at Newark Airport, and I'm also at a pizza shop, so we have lots of different locations going on. But Ulysses, did you want to just directly respond to that point that Barrett just made?
yeah, I was just going to read, because I have it under my eyes, a sentence. I was going to read a sentence from the Grundrisse Notebooks 7, which is really really great. And Marx, he has that great take. Well, it's not a take, but he says the full development of capital therefore takes place, or capital has posited the mode of production corresponding to it, only when the means of labor has not only taken the economic form of fixed capital, that's machines, but has also been suspended in its immediate form, and when fixed capital appears as a machine within the production process, opposite labor, and the entire production process appears as not subsumed under the direct skillfulness of the worker, but rather as the technological application of science. Thus, the quantitative extent and the effectiveness to which capital is developed as fixed capital indicates the general degree to which capital is developed as capital, as power over living labor, and to which the extent to which it has conquered the production process as such. Which is like exactly the idea that what you were saying, which is like Marx being like the development of capital. Basically, how developed capital is how much capital has appropriated living labor under the form of fixed capital that is the machine.
Right. I agree with that. Because the basic composition of capital as VCC uh, is expressed as the ratio between constant capital and variable capital, and he has various measures to that. One of them is called value added. This takes place within the process of circulation. Um, there is a whole movement from economists like Otto Bauer and the Austro-Marxist school, and like I said earlier with Son Rethel, that they were sort of lambasted as circulationists by the sort of more doctrinaire Marxists of the time. But as we can see, the addition to this problem of attempting to fix capital through the equation of not through the equation of fixed capital through the machinic process would be through a kind of movement towards circulation, towards the bespoke, the artisanal. And this is actually kind of what finance punk is about. Like I like to take volume 3 and I like to take Marx and I try to apply it to my own sort of system and see, well, how can this work and how can you ultimately export this to others? Because technically, communism is the real movement to abolish the present order of things. And so I do agree with that 100%. Now, to me, does the answer lie within the transvaluation process that gets, I guess you could say, from re-influenced by the producers harnessing those processes? Whether that's like something I advocate for is everybody owns a 3D printer, right? Because if there's no right to repair laws and you have this sort of excess consumer products that are sort of left over by the quote unquote bourgeoisie, they create an incredible amount of consumer waste, especially with things that bypass right to repair appendages. Now, if you could take those things and repair them, you can create subaltern forms of value, whether that's hobby shopping, and it's a way to sort of disalienate yourself from production. It's okay to turn the apartment you rent into a factory, for example, because you're no longer alienated from that process. So to me, it's less about identity and subjectivity, which I don't think even exists, given the ratio of the machinic versus the quote unquote organic. It's really a question of how do we relate to production? Do we own production? How can we own production? Whoa, that was a crazy honk. So sorry if Ulysses wants to respond to that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think I agree. And one of the questions was like when we talk about automation is that people will often think, that automation entails that people have to work less, which is like such a crazy idea, because people they think like if you automate something, it means that people have to work like less because it takes less time to
Right.
create the thing. But that's not how it actually works, because for capital, like what's interesting in automation, that is in like peak fixed capital, what's interesting in that is that it produces value, right? Like that if it produces value, it's because the machine itself has value. It's like an investment. But also it's the fact that it increases like the amount of surplus labor, which means that like the more you automate, the more you have an amount of surplus labor that you can then sell for capital, which means like the more that labor is productive, the more labor you can sell. So the more society gets automated, the longer people are going to work. And like in the last, I think, 40 years, I think this is an actually very accurate prediction by Marx, which is that people, now that there's more automation, people work longer hours. This was one of the predictions that Marx did.
Yeah. I think there's a quote that kind of gets at this from Marx, where he says, the more productive capital grows, the more it extends the division of labor and the application of machinery. The more the division of labor and the application of machinery extend, the more does competition extend among the workers, and more do their wages shrink. So I think one of the common misunderstandings of automation, for instance, is that it just takes away jobs. Um, it coincidentally also creates lots of jobs, like in the millions of jobs. So if I can't remember the exact number, but we're hearing numbers that around 100 million jobs will be lost. Maybe it's between maybe 70 and 100 million. But also it'll create 50 million jobs as well. So I don't think it's necessarily going to completely replace all labor or anything like that. But I also don't know if I'm talking past what you're saying, Ulysses. But it does of course create further divisions within identities within the United States and within intellectual labor.
Right.
It could create a new cognitariat class that is precariously coding, and it does replace a lot of cognitive tasks that would otherwise be displaced for academics, lawyers, and these types of people. Depending on the tier of their work, lower tier intellectual labor will be the first thing, of course, to be automated.
I can also just.
I'm not sure how that plays into what you're talking about, though, also, Barrett, but I feel like maybe there's
no, it really does, because Kojev, and this is a thesis that was taken further by Byung-Chul Han, remarked that sort of the post-historical man will be the the revolutionary subject of the post-historical man. Sorry, will be the subject that can liberate himself from himself.
Oh, wow.
So ultimately, and this is kind of why, left Hegelians and right Hegelians at this juncture both get this wildly wrong. You have right Hegelians like Nietzscheans who believe in biological materialism as a primary historical force, and then you have the left Hegelians who believe in sort of like monolithic groups like the proletariat. Now, we all know what poor people are like. They all want different things. Lyotard spoke extensively about that and made many polemics about it, and I think that's mostly true. Ultimately, the biggest problem that we have is that there is something inside of ourselves. Hegel, he says it's like this. He said it was the slave who takes the whip from the master and whips himself. In his sort of talk, and it was pious, it wasn't secular. He talked about a sort of dialectic of the spirit. And to me, the subject that the jobs that are created under automation right now, they're not, it's a part of Foucaultian control society, right? Like if in control society is it's no longer authoritarian. You've taken the roof off the factory. Now you're your own boss. You set the hours. It's about auto exploitation. Now the true revolutionary subject in Kojev's world would be somebody who does not necessarily, who can separate context from form and liberate themselves through object to object relations. This is sort of still post subject, you know, but at the same time, there is a process of alienation that goes into how we deal with our own sense of production. Like what qualifies as sort of like positive productive process, and what is a kind of nihilistic productive process, one that just sort of is for the sake of a kind of optimization. You can almost say like the cloud economy, there's no cool way to spin it. It's all nonsense, like it is all for the sake of optimal outcomes. There really is no sort of like inner liberatory process that goes through all of these things. And, we all do it to a certain extent, but to me, this is sort of a big question, like to what part are we, because of these new forms of technology, because of these new kinds of jobs that are actually being expanded, as you said, 50 million new jobs will be created. I'm not doubting that at all. I actually think more, because you've basically expanded the labor force. Everyone is sort of labor force of one of themselves. So to me, it's about alienated self-production versus optimal production.
I
If
just
that
have a
makes sense.
question,
That last part doesn't make sense.
Barrett,
Sorry.
then where do you see kind of then the financialization of capital? Where do you see that as kind of part of the conversation? I'm interested in like how, in the early aughts, the turn on trading on derivatives becoming part of the kind of productive or versus non-productive labor forms. If you could just speak briefly about like the financialization of capital and where it fits into all of this.
Well, it's less, I think, about the social categories of what's productive. There's a lot of discourse. Oh, Starbucks workers shouldn't unionize because they're unproductive laborers. Now, to me, that's nonsense, because we live under a certain set of rules and people have certain conditions that they want met, and they will just do what they need to do to attempt to meet or improve those circumstances or conditions. Like, there's no sort of moral judgment about that at all. To me, it's more about, it's less about the social categories of, because again, I don't think these things like, I don't think there's a sort of unifying factor between a productive laborer and an unproductive laborer. I think it's the way that we almost we exploit ourselves. I think that's sort of the greater equation into determining what that might look like,
Yeah,
rather than some sort of
totally.
like category or whatever.
I guess I just mean like it feels to me like the financialization of capital is like the greatest form of unproductive labor, like what's happening on Wall Street and these kind of like machinations that are ultimately not about creation. And that's where I see where it's like going back to the text. In fact, it's hard to find relevance and parallels because things have just progressed so much economically beyond so much of what Marx has written about, and even like Adam Smith and other economic thinkers from those eras. But yeah, I'll just open it back up to everyone.
I was having a problem. I was having a difficult time hearing you, Lily. Could you hear her, Barrett?
Oh yeah, could you hear me?
A little bit,
Ish.
yeah. It was cutting in and out, so
Oh,
it's sort
okay,
of
yeah,
hard
this
to.
mic is not great.
I would speak into the mic more, maybe.
Oh yeah, I was just talking about the kind of where we can see Marx's words still retain relevance and where they might not. Can you hear me? Yeah, maybe it's a bit louder now.
I think Barrett was talking about this idea of the ways that unemployment play into Capital Volume 3, along with proletariatization. And at least last time we talked, Barrett, you were talking about this idea of a shorter work week and the way
Right.
that unemployment is also, a part of the crisis. A part of the crisis of capitalism is that it will never be able to employ everyone. Technically, I mean, we could, and there's economic models for it, but it never does. And so, one of the ways that it possibly could would be to reduce the amount of working hours for each person.
100% agree with that. I think most of the problems can be solved by people just working less. Because that's the creation of the surplus value right there. I mean, like, that is the life force alongside, I mean, this act, I have to think about this for a second. Sorry about if you want to keep going. Wait, one
Yeah,
second.
I mean, obviously, this, you know, the surplus population in the past have been part of, building a quote standing army, you know, but now we've seen that the military is now not hiring as many people. At least a few years ago, my brother is in the military. He was telling me that there's a hiring freeze. And you know, as capital reaches its the extent of its growth, which we saw not only in the United States but also in China for the past decade, it will have to find new markets somehow to continue to exist, or it will have to go through some kind of permanent crisis. So Emmanuel Wallerstein would say that this is the natural cycle, and that we're waiting for a bigger crisis. And maybe Barrett, you would argue that the crisis is what frees us to realize that we need shorter working weeks. Aaron Bastani and the UK, part of No Hour Media, also argues for a shorter work week for probably different reasons. But if you combine that with people getting paid more, I don't think people object to the idea of a shorter work week. And Marx, of course, is talking about this as well. Ulysses, did you want to speak on that at all?
No, I'm good.
Okay. Barrett, did you have anything to respond on that?
No. One thing I would maybe say is that, you know, capital always has a sort of tendency towards the production of surplus value to outrun the pace at which the quote unquote capitals can find new uses for it. So a lot of this is just sort of like a lot of the things people inveigh against are sort of just products of the tendency of capitalistic accumulation. So it's an objective feature of the system itself.
Yeah.
And too much surplus value just basically on its own can result in unemployment, war, environmental degradation, the expansion of the state. You know, these are all byproducts of the accumulation of surplus value. So it's all about, at least in my mind, if we're just going to look really practically, basically becoming your own capitalist, because you're going to be, your whole goal is to take the profit away from the people who are literally in the business of creating the accumulation of surplus value. You know, somebody has to take that value away from them. And so to me, it's almost like an artisanal renaissance where people become their own sort of doctors and have their own sort of like, you know, kind of hidden practices and sort of work that way. Kind of like the Wild West once or something, or even like the Gilded Age of capital. Of course, there was state subsidies with the railroads and whatnot, but there was at least some sort of alternative market space. And this is kind of where some of the similarities between Marxism and funny enough, libertarianism collide in a strange way. The only difference is libertarians are corporatists, so they're basically like, well, the corporations can get as big as they want. I don't really care. So that would be the caveat between those two things.
Well, I mean, the corporation relies on Marxist principles to the extent that they would probably not exist without some type of, you know, socialist support.
Right.
Progressives like to say. Oh, we have a couple of comments here.
Oh no. Oh God.
God. Somebody, yeah. No, I mean, there's obviously the argument for capitalists to want a surplus value of labor because of the cost in the first place of investing in machines and the ability to keep the cost of labor down by, you know, controlling in a sense, the political world, you know. So if wages stay stagnant as they have, um, and it's cheaper to use humans, then it's more beneficial to the capitalists to invest continually in humans. And as we've seen, Moore's law has, in some sense, stalled. So the ability for machines to increasingly become cheaper and to become faster and more productive and to increase productivity for the market has thus stalled to a certain extent as well. That's the myth of you know of the singularity and AI taking over, is that AI and the ability of the world to shift to an automated has been shifted by first the cost of machines, they're really expensive, and there's incentives to have labor. During the pandemic, we saw that there was stimulus given for paying specifically employees. Um, the employees weren't given that. Corporations were given those stimulus checks. But at some point, we will see that the cost of machines will drastically decrease, and that this question will change, and the conditions will change, and that Marx couldn't have predicted this age that we're in. But if he was living in this current age, I'm sure he would have shifted his belief on the idea of surplus labor
Right.
that he talks about in Volume 3.
I think there was something very interesting that was being said about like some kind of bespoke production. I think like the basically the idea that like making objects in a non-alienated way that we're talking about, because this is interesting to me, because when you think about like what capital is actually doing, Marx, he has a good take on this. He says at some point, Marx, he says what is capital doing to like this production? Like when for example you say like if in my apartment I like turn it into factory and I produce my stuff. So what's the difference between that and capital? And Marx, he says it's really good. He says capital, what it does is it does an analysis of movement. It so for example, the way a horse walks, like like you can decompose the movement of those hooves. Is that the word? Anyway, you can decompose that into like all those small, minute, like individual moments that compose the way the horse walks, and that's like the analysis of movement. And like the way that when you produce an object yourself, let's think like in a very like simplistic way.
Do you mean produce
like
an object to sell, or do you mean like in the way?
No, let's just think about like you make a bowl of ceramic, with clay, with a potter's wheel. Let's just think at the most simplistic way. When you think about how you do that movement, it is not decomposed into individual moments. It is a single synthetic unity. Okay, so when a horse walks, there's no glitching. It's not decomposed into singular movements. There's no glitch in the walking of a horse. It has like its own rhythm, and it's like one single thing that's uninterrupted. And when capital comes along, what does capital do? Is that capital takes a synthetic movement, and what will be done is the analysis of that movement, and I mean it in the etymological sense, like the decomposition of that movement. That movement, like which is a singular synthetic movement, will be decomposed into analytical movements. Like for example, when you see those pictures of bird flight, and there's like that frame where the bird has its feathers, its wings, like in one position, then another position, like automation. What it really is, automation, is the decomposition of movement into singular moments, like this. You take a synthetic unity and you render it into separate moments. And so basically, what makes for a distinctively capitalist production is really the analysis of movement. There's a good way to study this. It's what Deleuze has to say about cinema, because cinema is exactly this. Cinema is the analysis of movement into frames. You know, it's like in nature, the movement is not analyzed into frames. There's no decomposition of movement into frames. Cinema is the art that comes along and decomposes movement into frames and then recomposes it. But so that's a good comparison with automation as the ability to decompose movement. So if you wanted to think of a way to produce something that cannot be alienated by capital, I don't know if that's even possible, but it would be something that you cannot decompose.
Right.
It would be a movement that you cannot decompose. Because if it can be decomposed, it can be appropriated by capital.
Maybe I'll just hop in. Can everyone hear me now? Yeah, you can? Okay, hell
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, cool. So it's 7:07, and we're gonna wrap this discussion at 7:15. And this has been really fruitful and exciting and great for my brain. It reminds me of being in graduate school when I was just but a young, budding Californian trying to impress everyone with my big words. But I've had a really great time, and it makes me want to learn more. So I was wondering if I could ask the 3 panelists to kind of round out the discussion and send us on our way with 1 or 2 books that each of you would recommend that maybe we read for further reading. So maybe Barrett, would you like to start?
I would recommend Intellectual and Manual Labor by Alfred Son Rethel. And I would also recommend The Dark Abyss of Time, The History of the Earth, and the History of Nations from Hook to Vico by Paolo Rossi. That's a really interesting book. It talks about various sort of technological and epistemological shifts that happen through various epochs of time. So those are 2 books I recommend.
Hell yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and your wise thoughts. Ulysses, would you like to give us 1 or 2 book recommendations and why?
Yeah, I would recommend the Economic Notebooks of Karl Marx. Because it has something in it. I cannot quite put my finger on what, but it has something in it that you won't find in Marx's published works.
Hell yeah. All right, Matthew, round us out.
Well, first I would recommend Barrett's book, The Spectre of Ben Funk, of course. You should definitely check out his book. But then also in terms of in terms of the economic conversation, I think a really important book, which is like one of the only sociological takes on money, is called The Nature of Money. It's a deep critique of Marx and his conception of the social money and the social forces behind what drives capital. It's more adapted to the age of financialization. And also the book Fictitious Capital, which obviously is one of the only books dealing with giving us a vocabulary and a basis of understanding for the age of money and the age of abstraction, basically. So.
All right, sick. And then I'll just throw in, because it came up a couple times, All That Solid Melts to Air by Berman.
And
because
somebody said Inventing the Future is good.
Inventing the Future. Oh, Inventing Future is
a good start. I think that's a good starting place.
Yeah, totally.
No.
Mixing.
I love all the comments. So
I'm not
good.
sure. Oh, yeah.
Well,
these are the last comments.
This was so fun, and I don't know if the stream is gonna continue, but the YouTube stream is definitely going to continue because we have 2 sick DJs coming in to spin for us for the next hour and 45 minutes, I guess. Yeah. So our first DJ is DJ Doge Emily, who is a DJ, producer, and organizer of Sweet Arts Club, a monthly party in Brooklyn that celebrates queer people of color. And I cannot wait to hear you spin. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thanks, you too.
Bye, guys.